Now, can everybody now see the screen? The Sussex Hall House of 1473. Can you, Anne?
Yes,
Good.
thank you.
Well,
Yes,
good
that's
evening,
fine.
good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming tonight. And I hope you'll enjoy my talk about this late medieval farmhouse. As built in 1473, it's a good example of the design of a standard medieval hall house that lasted actually for some 250 years. That's one reason why we chose to research it. And the other reason was that my late wife and I lived in it for nearly 40 years. I'm going to touch briefly on quite a few aspects of such a house, and I hope that'll give you a fairly rounded view. And I'm aiming to finish in 40 minutes rather than the 45 or 50, which I threatened originally. Now, for some reason or other, my slide advance isn't working. Yeah. So this is what it looks like now. It looks a bit like a pair of 1930s semis, but it's amazing to think that it dates to 1473, 12 years before the Battle of Bosworth Field. So it's a large, solid yeoman farmer's house. It's called Coppards, but this mainly 19th century facade is typical of the fate of many medieval or Tudor timber-framed farmhouses. And their timber frames became unfashionable and down market, and they either got pulled down or they had a nice Georgian front put on them, or they were covered up with tile hanging and underbuilding like this one. If they were in isolated rural locations and had lost their farmland, they often ended up as accommodation owned by big estates to house their servants and farmhands. That's what's happened here, first in multiple occupation, and then in the 1820s, formal division into a pair of quite good semis, hence the two front doors you can see. We bought one half and then the other half 25 years later and joined them up into one house again. It's in Chailey. If I can get my cursor to it, there's the Five Bells pub for those of you who know it, to orientate you. And Coppards is about 50 yards from the Longford stream, which is a tributary of the Ouse. Its landholding is unknown apart from its own messuage, that's A in this on this plan here, which was always just 7 acres. But actually, in the early 17th century, various Coppard families had all the holdings. You can see that I've marked A to G here, adding up to 200 acres. So the wider family were heavyweights locally then, and they were a century earlier too, as I'll show you. On now to say a bit about its timber frame design. This is a computer-generated reconstruction of when it was first built, and it's based on my measurement of its nearly 700 timber components. You can see the hall windows, which extend from the ground floor up to the eaves, back and front, and you can see it's got a jetty at one end that's to show off a modicum of wealth and status. And the jetty faces down the lane for visitors to admire as they walk up the lane or canter up on their horse. The timber framing panels were infilled with wattle and daub. This wattle, with most of the daub missing, is from about 1550. So you can see the split oak vertical staves with split oak wattles woven horizontally between them. I calculated there's about 2.5 tons of staves and wattles in the house, and they needed about 15 good unknotty tree trunks of about 1 foot in diameter under the bark from which to split the staves and wattles. The layout was standard for a hall house until all houses were built without an open hall from just before 1550. And Coppards has a 2-bay hall. That's one, the large bay and a smaller bay in the hall. And it's got a floored bay at both ends and a crown post roof which extends across the whole house. And that's bog standard for a hall house, a medieval hall house. Now, I haven't got time to go into the amazing carpentry of the house except to show you this. This is the tie beam lap dovetail tail joint, and it's an extraordinary piece of carpentry. This beam here on the right, that's the top of the bay post. Coppards, they're about 12 to 14 inches square. They're massive, and you can see the tenons of the bay post engage with the underside of the wall plate that sits on the top of the wall, and the underside of the tie beam, that's that big beam there, which runs across the house and stops the house doing the splits from the weight of the roof. So this is the most important joint in the house, and there are 10 of them, 5 pairs. The earliest surviving instance of this joint is in a barn of the 13th century in Essex, and it went on being used for over 500 years, the joint. The barn is still there. I think it's a wonderful symbol of the art and strength of English vernacular carpentry. And doing one well must have been a rite of passage for every apprentice carpenter. Here's the same joint at Coppards. The joint is 548 years old and showing its age a bit. The bay post has dropped a little bit. The bottom of the bay post has probably rotted, had probably rotted, which so you can quite often see broken joints of this kind. So now the tie beam is only doing its job out of habit. That's it there. Actually, it's held up by the massive chimney, which was put in about 125 years later. So how many trees were needed for a house like Coppards? And to begin at the beginning, I couldn't resist showing you this photograph, even though it's 20th century. It really does give an amazing graphic idea of the toil and trouble that medieval carpenters went through to source their timber from the yeoman farmers' woodlands. But how many trees were needed and what sizes? Well, to estimate how many and how much woodland they'd have come from, I used the methodology set out by a famous botanist and historian, Oliver Rackham. And I came up with this: 696 timbers, about 25 of them each from one single tree. Those are the red timbers shown here. 140 trees of various sizes altogether. And I calculated that about 5 acres of woodland would have been needed, carefully managed for about 50 to 80 years. And that shows that the yeoman may have built the house, or rather the carpenter built it for him, but it was his father and grandfather who grew it for him. In fact, centuries before 1500, woodlands were actively managed. So Rackham says in his great book, The History of the Countryside, hope you can see that, each wood had a name. Each wood was quite small, they were in private hands, and they were fenced all round to keep deer and other browsing animals out. Coppicing them yielded a regular crop, and the oak trees they left were literally a growing capital asset. So I'll come back to this again later. But where did we find the 1473 date? Well, there wasn't any documentary evidence, so we didn't expect any. So first we looked at the context, the building's position in the landscape and the buildings around it and the geology. And then its carpentry, is it oak or elm or softwood? The size of the timbers, the size of the building, which of the many assembly methods are used, such as crown post roof or side purlin roof, the type of joints, and the decoration it's given, such as chamfers and the chamfer stops, and mouldings, roll mouldings, and so on. To give you an idea of what can be achieved with all this physical evidence, when a group of about half a dozen of us from the Wealden Buildings Study Group, and I saw at least 2 of you here tonight, thank you, whenever we do one of our swift 2-hour surveys of somebody's house, we usually hope to date a house to within a 50-year bracket. But finally, there's dendrochronology, dating the growth ring, the widths between growth rings of trees. And here's our dendrochronologist at Coppards using a hollow drilled extractor core that goes through from the outer sapwood all the way to the innermost growth ring. It needs great skill to select a suitable beam and to aim the drill correctly. Back in his laboratory, he sands and polishes the cores so that the growth rings show up well, and then scans them into a computer database and compares the sequence of widths between the annual growth rings with regional and national sequences that have been built up over the last few decades of such research. And at Coppard's, he found one beam still double pegged into a bay post that dated to the winter of 1472 or the spring of 1473. And that's extraordinary, isn't it? And because timber framing was always done with green oak, not seasoned oak, because it was so much easier to work, we can be pretty sure that it was erected by the end of the year. And you can imagine the Mistress Coppard of that time insisting that they must move in before Christmas. So that's enough of the standing building for the moment anyway. Let's look at our documentary research. And I promise not to show you any other long lists. This is just to show you how very many potential sources we went through. And there were more too. The ones in red are the ones I'm going to briefly illustrate. Apart from the paper records, we did find one tablet of stone. Well, sorry, not a stone, it's a clay tile. I just thought you'd enjoy the cat's paw imprint, though he or she neglected to sign and date it. It is apparently an 18th century tile, which is quite old by roof tile standards, because obviously they don't survive for more than a few centuries. On to real documents. We were very lucky that one prosperous Coppard, William, got his posh lawyer William Newton in Lewes to write his very detailed will in 1614, though he didn't die for another 2 years. The will shows he was a very careful man, our William. First, he seemed very anxious to ensure that when he'd gone and their eldest son Nicholas was in charge, his widow Alice would still have all her proper widow's rights in the house. So, very unusually for a will, he named the house. And not only named it, but he described the rooms she was to have. And he did it in such detail that we'd be absolutely sure it's the same house. That's very unusual to happen in wills. So this 2-page will was the anchor point for all our research into the Coppard family. But you see from this little blow up of one line that he named the house as Copper's Bridge, that reads on the left, or Agmond on the right. And when they say something or something else, the or, the second one, means it used to be named the second name. Well, Agmond is a Scandinavian name that occurred in Norway from about 900 AD onwards. So first we looked for other Agmond lands around us, and to our surprise and delight, we found another 3 parcels of Agmond land, all within a mile or so. The biggest of these parcels, I've lost my cursor, there it is. The biggest of these parcels was held by Coppard's, and that's the 7 acres of Coppard's house itself. But together, these rather suggest, we thought, that the Agmonds once held a much more joined up swathe of lands, maybe either side of the Longford stream. But that's just speculation, it's not documentary research. So we started to look for documentary evidence of Agmonds. And I started with Domesday Book. I learned a new word, prosopography, from the historian C.P. Lewes of King's College London. That's an investigation of the common characteristics of a historical group of people, because he sent me the Agmond extracts from a prosopography study he and others had done of Anglo-Saxon England. But the nearest to Agmond, as you can see there, was in Ripe, a frustrating 11 miles away, and he had other holdings away further north and none to the west towards us. So he was no use to us, I don't think. And he was dispossessed after 1066. But we persevered, and you can see some other dates there with checking other sources. And we were pleased to find these in the 1300s. In particular, you'll see that in 1327 and 1332, there was a Coppard and an Agmond listed together, and they were in the same villata or small settlement and listed in the Sussex subsidies, local to here. And in the 1332 record, the 2 of them were both tax assessors in the same villata. So it's highly likely that they had to work together. They wouldn't be working together unless they were reasonably chummy. So there's a connection there. And that's where the trail ended, frankly. We can only be thankful we'd found this much so very long ago about a presumably yeoman family of the middling sort. So we can only wonder whether at some point a male Coppard married into the Agnons, and thus acquired their lands. That's, sorry, more speculation. So what else from early times? Well, go 50 years on. This is from a Newick. Newick is a village about 2 miles north of our part of Chailey. It's from a Newick manorial court book of 1403, and this was pointed out to us by Christopher Whittick, who was county archivist not so long ago, and it's recording that Lawrence Preston pays 5 shillings to marry his daughter Joan to William Coppard of Chagley, otherwise known as Chailey. So the family are still around in 1403. Well, so, I mean, somebody's got to be owning and growing the trees that the house was going to be built from. Next, we found this big jump to about 30 years after the house was built. We found it in the National Archive at Kew. This is a coroner's inquest report delivered to the King, that's Henry VII, at Lewes Castle in 1507. It's sad, it records the suicide of a man who threw himself into the Longford stream. And the coroner's report says, between Chailey Brigger and Coppardis Brigger. So 1507 is the earliest date that fixes the Coppard name and the bridge together, only 34 years after the Dendro date. So that gives us some security, if you like. The next record of the Coppards themselves, amazingly, is here on the very first page of the very first burial register, newly demanded by Thomas Cromwell in 1538. You can see 1538 at the top, and halfway down 1539 on the left. And it's recording the burial of Agnes, ye widow of Richard Coppard, October the 12th, and that's 1539. So the local parish registers were a goldmine for us for centuries, and finding this was just marvellous. Now, so were the Coppards' wills. I've shown you Williams of 1614 briefly, but we did find earlier ones, and wills are an important source, provided the people you're researching are wealthy enough to have made a will at all. This is 58 years before William, a line from the earliest Coppard will that survived, the will of John Coppard, who died in 1556. And he was most probably the son of Agnes, who's in that burials register you saw. And here's another example. This is the will of the son of the chap whose previous will you saw. He died only 21 years later. And what's good about the Coppard family is not only were they comfortably off enough to make wills, they also had the invariable habit of giving the names of all their children strictly in order of date of birth. So we cross-checked the lots of wills we found with the baptisms, marriages and burials in the register that I've just shown you. Then what about manorial court books? We eventually found, after several years, that Coppard's 7 acres was held by the Manor of Coombe, and all Coombe's court books are lost. But the Coppard family had many parcels of land, I showed you on that early map, that were held by other manors, and their court books did survive. And as landholders, the Coppards often attended those courts, and this is just one example. So we ploughed through innumerable court books and mostly enjoyed coping with the various hands, most in English, but some in Latin. This is a Balneath Manor court, one of the many possessions of Lewes Priory, and it tells us of a Robert Coppard in 1592, by which time, of course, Lewes Priory had been dissolved, so it wasn't in their hands then. So it tells us of a Richard Coppard who existed, who we could check against the baptism and marriage and burial records and so on. And this one, it's a century later, it tells us no more easily legibly that there was a Richard Coppard in 1659, and obligingly that he was of Denfield, another property in the village that we'd identified. So we could cross-check these 3 sources, parish registers, wills and manorial court books. And we had one more main source, and that was the parish vestry records, which the Coppards figure in because the vestry, which is a precursor of parochial church councils, was composed of the chief landholders of the parish, and that included lots of Coppards. So these 2 instances were helpful to us, told us that Thomas Coppard held Ye Cinder in 1658, and William Coppard is a bit more of a mystery to us, William the Wheeler. He most probably had his house and workshop on the village green beside the main road, but we never found it. So what I've shown you are a tiny fraction of all the Coppard references we found in all these sources, which together allowed us to piece together the genealogy of the Coppards. So starting with Agnes and Richard back in the 1539 burials, this is an extract of the chart that Sally built up using the Family Historian software package. Incidentally, she thought the Family Historian was an absolute nightmare. And here's what she finally achieved, the full family tree of the Chailey Coppards, nearly 200 of them, who lived in the village from 1539 to around 1730. And after that, there were few to record and none we could place in houses in the village. So I told you that Coppards ended up being owned by a big estate in the 17th century. The estate mansion was Aids, just 200 yards away up the hill. So there were no Coppards at Coppards, but we traced some of the servants and estate workers who were housed there conveniently close to the big house. One of them was the coachman. And here's a 19th century of a coachman. Nice example, George David. Someone needs to turn their microphone off if you wouldn't mind. A nice example, George David. A year after marrying, he became coachman to James Ingram, who bought the Aids estate, one of the largest in the parish. And George and his wife Sarah lived in half of Coppards for over 30 years. And this is part of several long pages of a letter from the Aids owner's daughter to her elder brother. And she began, "My dear James." They got married that day in 1843. And after the wedding, the bride and groom went off on honeymoon to Dover. Maybe they were headed for the continent. But anyway, after all the guests had left Aids, his young sister wrote him this long letter describing the servants' ball that the Ingrams allowed to take place in the big house that night. No doubt the servants had been working their socks off for weeks, preparing the reception. So here's our George Davy, who she wrote was the best dancer. And so George, the coachman, danced his way through life until the Ingrams buried him in 1868 in St. Peter's churchyard. The Ingrams seem to provide tombstones for several of their servants, and they inscribed George's with, "For upwards of 34 years, a faithful servant in the family of James Ingram, Esquire of Aids." You can just about read it on the real tombstone still. It was nice to put these fragments of George's life together. I really enjoyed doing that. Changing the subject, let's look quickly at life in the farmhouse. Here, I like to think, are William and his wife Alice. She joined him in the house when they married in 1590, when she was about 22 or 23. He died in 1616, aged about 53, but she was still in the house in 1628 and lived to a ripe old age of 77. Now, this stylish pair are house stewards at Bayleaf, and that's one of the first and biggest of the houses at the Wealden Downland Museum, and the house is similar to Coppards in construction. The clothes were very carefully researched by the museum as typical of around 1540, so that their stewards could have accurate costumes. Their volunteers did the spinning and weaving of the fabrics, they dyed them and made them up, all using authentic original methods. So we can be fairly sure that William and Alice really were clothed much like this. And their house looked like this when it was built in 1473. It was still like this when they got married, but it only took them 10 years to floor over the hall by 1600. William's father actually had made some minor changes. The wattled daub I showed you earlier on was part of that. You can see the pair of them seated at on their bench that was part of the original structure in hall houses. It was part of the specification of all these houses, sitting on the bench with their back against an oak planked screen, and the marks to show that the bench was there are still there, and a peg hole. To their right is the arched doorway to their private quarters. So I'm going to give you a quick tour of some of the house, borrowing more pictures from the Wealden Downlands house, Bayleaf. This is how the hall would have been furnished, a large eating and working space for the whole family, their servants and workers. You can see the tall windows which they have at the back of the house, and they'd have the same at the front, and we found evidence for this for these at Coppards as well. No glazing in the windows, of course, but there would be shutters. The hall, the Coppards Hall, looks like this now. There's the dais screen at the back, dividing the hall from the parlour. Above the screen is the dais beam, which stretches across the width of the whole house, about 22 to 23 feet, with its roll mouldings and its cavetto mouldings and some crenellation all the way along the top. So clearly designed to impress. And this is the ceiling that William and Alice put in within 10 years of them getting married, so that they could have a bedroom up above and a fireplace both in this room and up above too. Through that door, and that stair is not where the original would have been, through that door was what was later termed the parlour. We don't really know whether that term was used in medieval or even Tudor times. This is a typical 16th century parlour. It's based on the Wealden Downland reconstruction, and you can see it's sparsely furnished with bedstead, a crib for a baby, a chest and a couple of stools. And that's all the result of their documentary research. So this is William and Alice's private room. And here's the real thing at Bayleaf. You can see solid oak treads of the stairs going up to the chamber above, the parlour chamber. And here's a stair at Coppards. The treads are caught in tree trunks, or at least they're out of tree trunks. This surviving stair at Coppards, it's in a new position leading from the first floor to one of the lofts. But it seems likely that it's reused from its original position where it went up from the parlour up to the parlour chamber. And there's a stair like this at St Peter's Church in Ardingly, sometime it's about 10 miles away from Coppards, leading up to the belfry and the tower. And that's said to date from the first half of the 1400s. So if we go up the parlour stair, we arrive in the parlour chamber. This is at Bayleaf again, with a rather splendid 4-poster bed. Now, there was no ceiling, so lying in their 4-poster, this is before they floored over the hall and were living in luxury in their new hall chamber. So lying in their 4-poster, William and Alice would have had a view like this. But think of the spiders and rain and the snow blowing in between the tiles. So that's why anyone who could afford a posh 4-poster like that had one. It was a necessity, not only to give some privacy and to keep out the drafts, but its canopy kept this gentleman or lady out. This is a brown long-eared bat who was flying around our landing one January evening. So, before we leave the house, a few words about apotropaic marks. Apotropaic marks are evil-averting signs. This is the view William and Alice probably had from their bedstead in the room they created when they floored over the hall. It shows their new fireplace in their new bedchamber, and it's got a very generously wide fireplace for such a bedroom. You need to ignore the brick infilling, which is probably late Victorian. Now, you see some marks bang in the middle of the lintel. Well, people thought that evil spirits came into the house through the doors and windows and down the chimney, and at those points they put up marks to put them off. This fear was at its height throughout the 1600s, and the marks they made on fireplace lintels have survived best, these apotropaic or evil-averting signs, and they're most frequently in the form of deliberately made burn marks. Now, this is a close-up of what you can see on that lintel. They're made not with a candle, which if you hold it close enough to the beam to burn it, the candle soon collapses from its own heat. Instead, practical tests by members of the Vernacular Architecture Group have shown that they must have been made using tapers, and they moved the taper up as it burns down. So it was a slow, deliberate job, and it needed a lot of care to make a tidy mark. And a lot of the marks that you see are very tidy, like these three are. So we can speculate about what prompted them to be made, apart from the general fear of evil spirits, and why there are often several of them. Did the extra ones mark a wedding night, or a successful birth in this bedchamber, or death? And did the kids fool around making marks too? None of that we know. There's no documentary evidence of the making of these marks. Another quite sort of apotropaic mark is what are called daisy wheels, scribed with a pair of compasses with a little blade instead of a pencil. And this perfect one is on a fireplace lintel of a house just down the road from Coppards. And we don't know whether it was made as late as 1720 when the house was built, or whether this is a reused beam and the mark's much older. But here at Coppards, we found and traced this on the window jamb in the parlour chamber, clearly an attempt at the same kind of mark. A very poor attempt. Window jambs seldom survive. They're thrown out when the window is renewed and enlarged. So these faint marks right beside a surviving window opening are more rare than those on fireplace lintels. One further kind of mark I'm going to show you is this one. And this is on the fireplace lintel again, but this is in the kitchen extension built by William and Alice soon after 1600. 2 extra bays and another bit beyond that, and a corridor at the back, when they enlarged the house, and that was not long before William must have fallen ill. So this sign is interpreted as the sign for the Virgin Mary, a big letter M, or upside down, it could read Virgo Virginum. And these are really common, particularly on fireplace lintels. Let's go on to another subject and consider their farming activities a moment. Fattening beef cattle was the mainstay of most medieval and Tudor farms in the Lower Weald. They're on heavy clay, difficult to cultivate for arable without modern machinery, and not suitable for sheep, despite this picture. I guess they'd have sold them on the hoof at the markets in Maresfield, Linfield, Uckfield, maybe Cookfield, Ditchling and Ringmer, and of course at Lewes. But they'd have had some arable, growing oats and lots of legumes for themselves and for fodder, and some wheat for themselves. And they may have grown flax. This flax on the left, that's a picture by and of the Wealden downland of flax being stacked to dry. I show flax because they certainly grew hemp, as William left in his will the requirement that the profits and fruit that grow in and upon my garden and hemp land should go to Alice. So she was probably spinning hemp. They had flax bed sheets and hemp bed sheets, and it's likely that they were growing some hops. So it was very varied mixed farming, and that's not the half of it, as William's will shows us again. Look at this. This is at they've squeezed an extra couple of lines in right at the very bottom that says, also, my will is that my executor here named, that was Nicholas, shall keep for my wife 1 cow, both in winter and summer, as he keepeth or would keep his own during her widowhood. He's a careful man, that William, not trusting Nicholas, once again making sure that Alice got her dues. But it does kind of illustrate that women's work was never done, because even if Nicholas was doing the mucking out after his death for this cow, it's most likely that even in her old age, Alice went on doing the milking and the dairying. So I've jotted down all the things that she was probably responsible for. She'd have had helpers, of course, not only her children working with her, but also a servant, or 2 possibly, possibly the daughter of a neighbouring yeoman or husbandman. And it's a huge list, isn't it, for a farmer's wife? And she must have learned all these skills from her mother, I suppose, as a girl. And they're critical for the whole farmstead's viability, especially in winter. Meanwhile, the men were asleep in the barn. There's no documentary evidence of that. This is a medieval barn near Etchingham. Unfortunately, there's no evidence of the barn or barns that would have been on the Coppards lands. But it shows you what would have been typical. Medieval Wealden barns were typically quite small and often multi-purpose. They housed cattle and hay for their winter feed and grain, particularly oats for animal feed. And well, of course, the men would have been busy too, with hedging and ditching and ploughing and cartage. And as I did want to get a picture of oxen in the picture, here are some, thanks to a picture from Lewes History Group. That's what they'd have used for their ploughing and for their cartage, as here in quite recently, 1904. There was one winter job that everyone joined in with, and that was coppicing, to come back to a subject I touched on before, the cutting down to the ground of the understory in woodland every 15 or 20 years. They'd have done 1 acre or 2 every winter, perhaps, something like that. And this yielded firewood, which was essential for any farmstead, and it also, of course, was a cash crop for larger farms such as coppards, as well as providing material for essentials such as hurdles. The good oak trees, they would have left to grow on for around 50 years, so they'd have coppiced twice or more, probably 3 times, before the trees were harvested as structural timber. These trees we term standards, and hence the term coppice with standards, which you might have heard of. And here's the result of a day's coppicing, hazel rods, I think. And these, of course, are Land Army girls from World War II, and they're working in Chailey, coppicing woodland. The lady on the right was the ganger, Marjorie Davis, who was older than the rest. And in the war, she was billeted with her girls at a requisitioned house just up the road. Before we leave the subject of farming, here's some advice. In winter at 9 and in summer at 10 to bed after supper, both maidens and men. In winter at 5 o'clock servant arise, in summer at 4 is very good guys. So now I'll close with a little, I'm afraid a very little, archaeology. These were the only noteworthy ceramic sherds we found, identified by Luke Barber, who used to be Sussex Archaeological Society's research officer. And they're recorded in the Portable Antiquities scheme run by the British Museum. This is half of a baldric buckle. The slide's a bit confusing. It shows either side of the same half we found. Anyway, a baldric buckle is for a sash from which a sword might be suspended. This is dated to around 1650, and we found it beside the path leading from Coppards up to Aids, the big house. One thinks of a Roundhead or Cavalier, perhaps, strolling with his lady on his arm. Sorry, in the midden was lots of 19th century blue china, as you might have expected, and around the house and garden were these clay tobacco pipes. I learned that the bowls that lean forward are earlier, so the left-hand ones are probably late 16th century onwards, and those where the bowl top is in line with the stem are the later ones. And a delightful modern find. Actually, I think this is the most interesting thing we did found, or rather metal detectorist found it. He was assistant to Stephanie Smith, who some of you will remember was our excellent finds liaison officer at Barbican House at the castle about 10 years ago. It's a little 19mm wide metal button, which I identified from the uniform of from the uniform of the Royal Observer Corps. It shows a coast watcher. Here he is, with his arm outstretched, holding a flaming torch, a flaming beacon beside him, the sea stretching away, and the coastline stretching away as well, with lighted beacons at intervals all the way along. So the Royal Observer Corps badge harks back to England's early warning system for the approach of the Spanish Armada. And true enough, the owners of the other half of Coppards in the 1950s were Charlie Thorne and his wife Dorothy, and Charlie was a leading observer at the underground early warning post in Newark that was part of the huge network of over 1,500 posts that were to tell us we had 4 minutes left before the nuclear bombers arrived. So that was quite a find, really. And the final item I've selected are these common glass bottles. They're embossed Eiffel Tower fruit juices, They date from 1891 onward, and Foster Clark's, who made them, were based in Maidstone. Quite common, but it's curious that their advertising reached the wilds of Wales. This is a large poster pasted onto the back of an internal door of a farmstead in West Wales that I photographed in 2013. The function of the poster was to stop the drafts coming through the gaps in the planks of the door. And it proclaims, Eiffel Tower concentrated lemonade, none genuine, without the Eiffel Tower trademark. Fortnum's Halfpenny makes 2 gallons, which must have been a bargain even then. So maybe that's why, back at Coppards, the Midden yielded so many of their bottles. So I did enjoy joining up things like this. I'm going to finish quickly with the subject of water wells. This pic, as usual, shows the men looking on while the woman does the work, but it also does show, and this is corroborated by other early pictures I found, that wells didn't used to have a large and fancy tiled roof, just a couple of little planks, enough to protect the hemp rope that was wound round the winding spindle. And they didn't have a wall round, just a boarded cover. On to Coppards Well. And here's Sussex archaeologist Lisa Fisher, who kindly offered to do a small exploratory dig down the outside of our well. The inside was too difficult, about 16 foot of water all year round, with the level starting 16 foot down, so a big job to drain, to shore up, to ventilate and dig, so we didn't. Incidentally, the well had just a drain cover over it until we built this inauthentic wall round it in 2008, but at least it's in handmade bricks and lime mortar. Sadly, Lisa's expert dig did not yield anything at all significant, but it's a good note to end on, as we really did try. So thank you, Lisa, very much. Sally and I treasured your kind help. Well, I'm through. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope you've enjoyed listening, and I hope there's time for questions or comment if you have any. Oh, and on the left is a 300-page book we produced to capture in remorseless detail everything we've learned. It's almost completely out of print now. So thank you again, and over to Anne.
Oh, thank you very much, Peter. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think what we need to remember is archaeology isn't just buried stuff, it can be standing stuff. And when you're able to link up the documents to the evidence in the building, that's particularly worthwhile. I'm sure you must have had many happy years researching this. If anyone's got a question, if you click on the little box which says chat and type it in, that will make sure I see it, because I won't be able to see you all waving at me to ask questions. So yes, I think there's someone trying to talk who's muted. If you'd like to say something, you need to click on the microphone symbol that's got a line through it, and then you'll be able to talk.
Peter, thank you. That was really lovely.
Thank you, Pam.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Very slick, Peter.
I've got a question from Amanda Saunders.
Yes, I'm no expert, Amanda. The basic design of hall houses, and Wealdens in particular, and ours wasn't a Wealden, was the same across the whole of Kent and Sussex, east and west, and Surrey and Essex. But hall houses in Kent, they were bigger and more elaborate, more highly decorated, most of them, than those of them in Sussex. But there were lots of similarities, and there's been a major study done of medieval timber framed houses in Kent, which you could explore if you wanted to know more.
Who is it done by, please? Who has done the one on Kent?
It's by, oh, well, several authors. It was part of a royal commission.
Oh, right. Sorry.
And if the title of it, if you try Googling it, is the Medieval Houses of Kent by
Thank you very much.
by the Royal Commission on the Historical Monuments of England.
Thank you so much.
That's a pleasure. And it goes to 3 volumes.
Oh, Lord, thank you.
Can I ask a question? Could I ask a question, Peter? Was it obvious where the open fireplace was? If your house was similar to Bayleaf House, was it an open fireplace or was there a chimney obviously built?
No. If there had been any evidence in relatively modern times, it was destroyed when they dug out the floor of the hall to put in a suspended floor. And any archaeological evidence of the hearth would have been destroyed then. There are 1 or 2 archaeological reports of hearths found in excavations, but basically they need to be in houses where the house has not gone in, the house fell into non-use while the hearth was still there, rather than when they put chimneys in, they would have swept away the old hearth.
Would the middens have always been in one particular point near the house?
Well, we found only one distinct place. That was either because somebody had done some major tidying up, or over a period of time they were only using one. But that having been said, in the midden, thinking about it, we didn't find anything that was earlier than 19th century.
Talking about middens, Peter Holmes has the question, was there any sign of an overhang added in the parlour chamber for a basic toilet, as in the Alfriston Clergy House?
No. No. No, there isn't. And no evidence at all for what the arrangements were. Somebody's asked, were we able to date the chimneys? And the first chimney was put in when the floor was when the hall was floored over in around 1600, and the chimney dates from then, and was one of the reasons to put a chimney in so you can heat the room without smoke, and to put a hearth in the upper room as well, the hall chamber. The flooring over and the chimney were joint motivations from about 1475 onwards through till from about 1550 onwards through to 1650 onwards, when that process was completed.
I think Janet Pennington's got a question. Would you like to unmute and ask it, Janet?
Peter, what a super talk. I have your book by my side, but just hearing you talk about it is wonderful. Thank you very much. I did just wonder, when you were talking about the ritual protective marks, I can never say apapatreg. I have to have it written on my computer here so I can
So did I.
It's a horrible, horrible word. On the window jambs, there was one on the window jamb which you thought might have been might have been what you call a daisy wheel. I'd call a hexafoil. Could it have been a spectacle mark or a start of spectacle marks of like this? I've seen some on a window jamb at the Priest House at West Hoathly, and 1 or 2 other places. They are sort of like pince-nez, and sometimes they're faded or they haven't quite been finished. I mean, just a remark. It could well have been the start.
Well, I think you're probably right, and spectacle marks and hexaphiles, to use your more correct term, are very clear.
All sorts of terms. Don't worry. Just call it what you think.
Yes.
Anyway, it was very interesting to see yours again close up. Thank you.
Yes.
Could I just ask very quickly, would the beams that were and wood that was used to box in the large space of the open hall house have been new wood, or would they have got it from other sources?
Well, that depended on the wealth of the family who were doing it. At Coppards, it was all brand new timber. It wasn't reused. And reused timbers become more obvious as the 1600s go on than earlier. But the house down the road, the one with the hexafoil that I showed you the picture of, that I said was built in 1720, I remember that when our Wealden Buildings Study Group went round it, we and the, actually I was going to think of the owner, when she sat down with us when we did our debriefing, and she said, so you're saying almost all the timbers in my house are reused. I'm the kind of recycling centre of the 17th century of Chailey, and that was a very illuminating comment she made. The whole house appeared to have been built of timbers from a previous house.
Got a question from Rose Griffiths. Do you think the lack of older artifacts dug up is a sign of less habitation, or just less exploration of lower inaccessible layers?
No, I think it's intensive use of the garden for fruit and veg, and then for ornamental flowers and plants. Very, very deep soil, beautifully tilled, lots of organic matter and lots of soot in it. So I think that's the reason that they were fishing things out and throwing them away more permanently later on.
I suppose any kind of manure heap would be used as fertilizer taken elsewhere rather than just
It was
building up.
interesting, actually, that Luke Barber, when he looked at our sherds, he said, of course, these could have come in with a load of manure from somewhere else. So unless you can, in your archaeology, you can be sure that the strata that you get it out of is undisturbed, you're not actually certain that it came from that place. You might be able to tell its date by the type of the sherd, but you can't necessarily attribute it to that location.
Just a sort of slight aside, years ago when we lived in an old cottage at Botolphs down the Ada Valley, before I knew much about maps and various things I could find in my sort of beginning to look at house history in a very rudimentary form, in one part of the garden, which hadn't been dug for 20 years, we found coins. We found not old coins, but we found a Queen Victoria bun penny, I think we used to call them, but there were sort of odd coins, mainly pennies or sort of halfpennies, between about sort of 1840 to 1910, and I just wondered why I'd found these in this certain place. And then when we looked at, started looking at maps, it's where the privy was. So it was just stray losses from trouser pockets, which I wouldn't have dreamt of thinking that was the reason, some hoard, some sort of 19th century hoard. Often there's a very simple reason for something you're trying to make much more complicated.
There was another reason for our lack of archaeology, and that is that we were focused on above ground, and we had met members of the Wealden Building Studies Group who were similarly focused. We hadn't met any archaeologists, and despite the fact that the assistant county archaeologist commuted past our door, and whilst we were doing all our building work, we could see anything up to 13 builders' vans outside. He never stopped to say, were we doing any archaeology? And if somebody had said we could and should, because we were digging for new drains and so on and so forth, I think we probably would have found much more.
Yes, in the early days, I remember when I joined the Wealden Building Study Group, which I think was 1983, people were, as a new girl really, people were focused on the buildings, but not thinking about documents. And I was very document focused. And of course, you know, now you wouldn't dream of looking at a house without looking for the documentary background. And if you've got some archaeology as well, well, goodness me, the world's your oyster, isn't it? It's wonderful.
Incidentally, Peter Burton mentions that the book I was talking about, The Medieval Houses of Kent, one of the authors is indeed Sarah Pearson, but there are the other volume, the principal authors are other than Sarah Pearson, but you could search under her name, Sarah Pearson.
Thank you very much.
Well,
Okay.
any more questions or comment?
We're having lots of messages of thanks. I think there's a
Could I just say that the oldest thing we found, we live in a very old hall house, but a very modest one in Kent. And my son went to see all the people digging at Canterbury in the archaeological television program, and came back, and at the age of 7 was terribly excited and rushed off to get my mother, his grandmother, to go and check in the garden what he'd found, at which point she became the oldest thing that we found in his particular excavation, because she didn't see where it started, didn't know what was going on, and fell into it. Sadly, it wasn't in the midden, so we didn't find anything else of any interest at all. But he is now a very competent archaeologist, so hurrah for these wonderful houses.
Yes.
It's Grace. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me, Grace?
Yes.
I'm a little bit ignorant. I understood that it wasn't just the nuclear family that lived in one of these hall houses. There were lots of other people that lived there communally. My involvement with the hall house is the Bridge Cottage at Uckfield, which I helped to rescue with the History Society that was there. Can you say anything about the type of communal living, or what did you discover anything from the records of who was in the house?
Grace, that's a difficult question, and I haven't got an answer to it because we didn't find any evidence.
Okay.
One of the difficulties was that it's the men who appear in the documentary records, apart from the parish register. The parish register rarely tells you what house the person was in.
Yeah.
In fact, most of the documentary records rarely tell you. So when I showed you one showing somebody whose property was mentioned, that was a gem to have. So yeah, there's the presumption that 2 or 3 generations were in the house at any one time.
Yeah.
And aunts and uncles as well.
Yeah.
And I suppose you might, if you were lucky enough to have a probate inventory, but of course they wouldn't be sort of usually back in the 1400s, you might have something like the men's chamber, possibly, which might indicate that labourers were sleeping there.
Yes. We didn't find any Chailey inventories until after 1700, which is why.
Oh, right, yes.
So
Yeah.
we were lacking that very
Of
much.
course, yes, there aren't so many in East Sussex, for East Sussex.
I know with Bridge Cottage, they had in the upper part something called the solar. And I believe that that's where the family could retire to.
Yeah, the solar is another name for the parlour and parlour chamber.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, so it's the same. The parlour chamber, I think, is called the solar.
I'm very impressed with how much you've discovered. Thank you.
I think the big difficulty is that we don't know actually what in medieval times they called these rooms themselves. We do know that the hall was called the hall.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't a multi-story.
Thank you.
The biggest room, the living room, was called the hall.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you everyone for coming along.
Yes, thank you, Peter. That was most fascinating talk, and obviously a labour of love in the real sense, and also generated some real understanding and enthusiasm for these wonderful buildings.
About 6 years, spread over about 6 years. Yes,
indeed. Yes.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Peter. Thank you very much. Fascinating.
Brilliant.